Good morning, afternoon or evening, everybody. Welcome back to part 3 of the Hunting Jagdpanther build. This episode will focus on detailing, decals, mud effects and chipping. If you haven't seen part 1 or 2, you can use the link above to check them out. Without further ado, let's get cracking. I start with some Vallejo gun metal grey for the gun and for the tow cables. The paint is diluted with some water to ease the process. I then add some German grey to the mix to paint the shovel. Next, the exhaust stacks are painted in a German grey. These will be weathered later on. Finally, I paint all the wood elements in an earth brown. I apologize for the lack of footage on painting the smaller details. If you would like to see more of this, let me know in the comments. Next up, the decals. First thing to do is to lay down some gloss varnish where the decals will be applied. For this, I'm using X22 clear from Tamiya, mixed 50-50 with acrylic thinner. There isn't many decals on the Jagdpanther, so this is a fairly quick process. Next, I soak the decal and put a layer of microset on the area the decal will be applied. Then I carefully release the decal from its backing paper. I put it in the wrong place at first, so carefully repositioned it with some tweezers. Using a cotton bud, I soak up any excess water and gently press the decal into place. To help the decal form around the zimmerit, I put a generous coat of microsol over the top. This will soften the decal and allow it to be pressed in place, again using a cotton bud. The final stage is to press it into all the gaps. I use an old airbrush needle for this. It actually splits the decal slightly and allows it to be properly formed around the squares in the zimmerit. The emblems are added using the same process. The rear decal is a lot easier to apply thanks to the lack of zimmerit on this area. The process is still the same. Soak the decal, apply microset, apply the decal, dry, apply microsol, and press the decal down using the cotton bud. The good thing is, with the flat decal, you don't have to faff around trying to get it to melt into the zimmerit pattern. The final thing to do is to apply a coat of satin varnish over the top. This both blends the decal into the paintwork and gets rid of that glossy shine from the gloss coat. Next up, a spot of chipping on the wheels. For this task, I'm using German grey paint from Vallejo and an artist's sponge. First, I make a diluted paint solution and soak a small piece of sponge. Then, I unload most of the paint onto a piece of kitchen towel. Next, I carefully dab the wheel with the sponge, focusing on high wear areas like bolts and the rim. Every now and again, I repeat the sponge soaking process and keep going until I am satisfied with the amount of chips. The process is repeated with the sprockets and the rest of the wheels. Now it's time to join some of the chips together, and in this case on the sprocket, paint the areas the sponge couldn't get to in between the teeth. Once I am satisfied with the amount of metal showing, it's time to blend the chips with some dark rust tones. I decant some thinners and dark rust. This makes it easier to work with and avoid any spillages. It's now a case of painting over all the chipped areas with the rust tone and blending with the enamel thinner. This both blends the chips and gives the impression of a dark red primer layer under the paint. Now for some oil washes, I mix up a dark brown solution using oil paint and white spirit. For oily tones, add blue to the solution. For dirty tones, add more light brown. The mix I have done is very dark, and the purpose for this is to add shadow and dirt to some of the detail. I use white spirit to blend some of the areas. The process is repeated on the sprocket and the rest of the wheels. You never really know what it's going to look like until it is dry. To speed up the drying process, you can use a hairdryer. With the wheels complete, it's time to add some mud. I'm using weathering paste, some pigments, and some grass for this process. I start by mixing up a sludge solution with the paste. I add grass for texture and dilute with enamel thinner. I'm also mixing up 2 different tones of pigment into a wash solution. This is simply the powder diluted down with the enamel thinner. Once I have all the ingredients mixed up, it's time to start pasting it onto the lower hull of the tank. I start with the muddy paste solution, creating build-up in areas mud would get stuck. Every now and again I use some of the washes to dilute some muddy areas further. Once completely covered, I use a hairdryer to speed up the drying process. Once the first layer of mud has dried, it's time to add some variation with the washes. This again is just a case of painting areas you want some difference, adding streaks and blocks of different tones. Can't tell what it will look like until it dries, but this process can be repeated if not satisfied. Again, I dry with the hairdryer to speed up the process. With the second layer dry, I use a dry brush to blend the edges of the dusty tones. And that's it. The mud is added, and the wheels can be fitted for the final time. Now to chip and fill in the battle damage on the hull. First stage is to cut a small piece of artist sponge and rough up the edges. This will give variation in size and shape to the chips. Now it's the same process as the chipping of the wheels. Load up the sponge with German grey and unload most of it into some kitchen towel. With that done, it's time to chip. I'm starting on the skirts, dabbing, reloading, unloading, and more dabbing until I am happy with the amount of chipping. Next, with a brush, I join some of the chips together and fill in any gaps in the Zimmerit. Again, I have to apologize for the video quality here. It seems the zoom setting on the camera is not suitable for this kind of thing. Certainly an area to improve going forward, but I hope it still gives a good understanding of the process, even if it's a bit blurry. The process is continued over all areas of the tank that steel may be showing. I avoid chipping the Zimmerit areas, as this would be a light grey under the paint rather than steel. This process does take some time, but in my opinion, is the most effective way to chip a tank with an element of control. Top tips are to take your time and ensure there's not too much paint soaked in the sponge. It's always easier to add larger chips with the brush rather than trying to remove large areas of grey. This process is really effective around hatches and areas that stick out. You can use the sponge to chip mainly the edges and high wear areas, then go around the edge with the brush. If you have found this video helpful or mildly enjoyable over the blurriness, could I please ask you hit that like and subscribe button? This will help me grow and maybe one day help me towards a slightly better camera. Thank you. With the whole thing chipped, that's where we're going to leave this video. The next video, we will be getting this big cat finished. That won't be the end to this project this time, as once the tank is finished, we will be moving on to building a diorama for it. But for now, farewell. As always, thank you for watching, and happy modeling, everybody.